My name is Father Henry, and I have been a monk here in Glenstal since 1970. My father, being a doctor in the army, I grew up in several places, Limerick, Cork, but mainly in the Curry camp, where my father was medical officer for 25 years. I went to school in Newbridge College with the Dominicans, and from there went on to read history and political science in Trinity College in Dublin. It was relatively unusual in those days, mid-60s, for a Catholic to go to Trinity, and I received very little encouragement from the school because it was so unusual. And it's interesting, for example, that in a group of 35 of us, there were only 5 Catholics, of whom 3 were from Great Britain. And there was also a very large contingent of students from the north of Ireland, which I think, by the way, is an aspect of Trinity that has suffered over the last while. Following Trinity, I came here, and Trinity, in fact, strangely enough, is one of the reasons why I'm here, because a Church of Ireland friend was asked by a monk of Glenstal, the organizer of the then relatively new ecumenical conference, for a Catholic student to come to attend. Now, I was actually rather busy that summer and I refused initially, but he came back to me in despair, so I came here. And the strangest thing happened. I had been vaguely thinking of perhaps a religious vocation. I wasn't quite sure. And obviously, because I had been to school with the Dominicans, they were my first port of call. But when I came here, I suddenly knew, even if on a subliminal level, that this was where I was going to end up. What impressed me most was the solemn celebration of the liturgy. What also impressed me was the clear interest in the community in scholarship, the encouragement of studies. So relatively quickly, in fact, I ended up here a year later, in October of 1970, at the age of 22, not without a certain suspicion on the part of the community, because I was regarded as a bit long in the tooth. It was quite normal in those days for somebody to enter the monastery at 17, 18, but 22 was already regarded as almost ripe for the pension. Having made profession and we were then sent to the school. It was quite usual then. One was expected to teach. I taught some history, some Latin, etc., and then some general supervisory work, etc. The idea was to introduce people to one of the main works of the house. Being aware of the fact, of course, that one of the great advantages of a Benedictine monastery is that no monastery is tied to any particular work, but in our case, the main work tended to be the school. We also had a farm, gardens, etc. When it came then, it was clear from me from the beginning, which is not always the case in the monastic life. One doesn't have to be a priest, but it was clear to me that I wanted to be a priest, so I needed to do the proper theological studies. We had a tradition of studying abroad in France, Belgium, or in Sant'Anselmo in Rome. And it was felt that we needed some kind of more Germanic touch. You will remember, of course, many of you will know that the German theology was very much the fashion, particularly the aftermath of the Vatican Council, etc. So I was asked to go to an enormous monastery. It was the biggest monastery I'd ever seen, of Mr. Schwarzach near Würzburg, which belongs to the missionary Benedictine congregation of St. Ottilian. And this monastery had 22 teaching workshops, and one of them was a silversmith's workshop, and I was asked to become an apprentice there. They were looking for apprentices, particularly monastic apprentices. And that was a heaven-sent opportunity for me, because I had always hoped in some way to work with my hands. So I started the apprenticeship. It had been agreed that I would stay for a year, and if I had to leave and perhaps go on to Sant'Anselmo as had been planned, then the apprenticeship could be broken. But I was very lucky in that I learned German very quickly. The workshop worked out extremely well, and I was allowed by my abbot to stay on to finish the training as a silversmith. So it meant that I had spent from 1973 to 1980 in Germany. I was ordained deacon there in 1978. Then I came back here in the summer of 1979 and was ordained priest, but returned to Germany then to finish my degree. I came back here then in Christmas of 1980 and was immediately made assistant novice master. And I was also asked then to work at the school, where I worked teaching mostly history and German for basically the next 20 years. During this period in the school, I was also invited to be a member of various commissions, such as the Bishop's Commission for Art and Architecture, etc., of course in an advisory capacity. And I also from time to time managed to do some work in the reordering of churches, etc. Then I was invited to teach for some years in what had just become the University of Limerick, particularly teaching teachers to teach German. That was a highly enjoyable experience. Also during this period, starting in 1977, in fact, I translated regularly at the Abbots Congress, which took place in Rome every 4 years, where all the abbots of the world come together. At the Congress of 2000, a friend of mine, whom I had known for the previous 30 years, was elected abbot primate. And somewhat to my surprise, he had asked me to become his secretary. And so in 2001, I went to Rome and I stayed there until 2013 as secretary to the abbot primate. Now, Rome, of course, sounds extremely exotic, etc., etc. And of course, in the beginning, it can be so. But like everything else, it becomes routine. And it was basically an office job, answering the telephone, being there when the primate was away, etc. I remember as a child people saying to me, oh, the first thing you should do when you go to Dublin is go up Nelson Pillar, because if you don't do it the first time, you'll never do it. And that is, in fact, what happened in Rome to me. Lots of things that I should have seen, would like to have seen. I never got around to doing it. But, however, it was, for me, very definitely a changing experience. Also, I should say, I was made Master of Ceremonies, which I greatly enjoyed. And that also put me at the center of the organization of the liturgy, which also in St. Anselmo is extremely important. And that is a thread that really has run through all my life. I've been extremely lucky here in Glenstal, in Minster Schwarzach, in St. Anselmo, that the liturgy has always been available and has always been beautifully celebrated. I came back then here in at the end of 2013, and I resumed, in fact, an activity with which I'd been involved before I left, which is archivist. Being by training and by nature, I suppose, an historian, archives are very important for me because they reflect the actual memory of the house. So that's one of my main activities at the moment. I am too old to teach at the school, unfortunately, because I've loved teaching, but I still do some teaching in Mary Immaculate College, which is part of Limerick University. Again, teaching teachers, in this case, sacramental theology, which is very great fun. To ask me after 50 years, would I do anything differently? The answer, of course, to that is I just don't know. But if I could go back to one experience I had, I remember when I was 8 years of age, going for a walk on the Curragh Plains and having this extraordinary feeling of the need for prayer. Now, I couldn't express it any more clearly than that. But that really is what I've been seeking ever since. And it's what prompted my coming to the monastery. I like to think that it's what prompts my everyday, though that would probably be going a little bit too far, as my confreres will attest. Whether I've actually discovered prayer, I think that is a question that will only be answered when I die. But occasionally, yes. And I think there's one very important thing, certainly for me, It happens once or twice a year. You're standing in choir and you're singing, and suddenly you realize this is where I am supposed to be. Now, that may happen once a year, twice a year, three times a year, but that really ultimately makes sense to, gives sense to the whole project. Looking back, I feel that I've had a very varied, very rewarding, and in some cases, very challenging life. And so I'm just waiting for the eschaton.